Good morning. Okay, this is a bit of a strange setup, but I've decided this morning I'm going to do this video, and I'm actually going to switch over from looking at me to you looking at my notepad in just a moment. And what we're going to talk about this morning are issues related to some of the things that I've been seeing on your discussion board. So what are the things you're thinking about? What are the things you're talking about? And I want to just make some clarifications about that. Okay. All right. So one of the things that I really want you to be thinking about is, what do we mean by inclusion? And, I realize that from this group in particular, or the larger group, that I've been asking you to read policy documents and thinking in a very broad way about inclusion and why we include. However, the assignment then has you get quite specific in terms of children with special needs and how to apply those policy documents. So I'm going to talk to the other side of the assignment a little bit this morning. Okay. One of the images that I really like, and I've got the link up at the top there, but I will post it on the announcement board, is thinking about the difference between exclusion and segregation and inclusion. Okay, so over here we've got our classroom. These are our typically developing children, and all these other dots, these are our children that present with some diversity or difference. And as you can see in this diagram, they're on the outside. They're on the outside of the classroom setting. Okay. So what this might look like is they might be in a classroom somewhere else, or they might not be at the school at all. And then we've got another model where you see oftentimes maybe this is the whole school or the classroom, and then the children that have diversity or difference are together inside this room. Okay, so they're within the school, or they're within the class, but they're not actually a part of learning. And then what we're talking about with inclusion is when our students that have special needs, disabilities, diversity, difference, whatever you want to call it, they are fully integrated into the ongoing learning of the classroom or school. Okay, does that make sense? So one of the things that I've noticed is in your examples is we have lots of talk about kids, and I really am going to pull you up on this, and I'm going to caution you. And I was wondering why this was so important, and I heard Nikki Barnes, who is a lecturer at CDU, give a talk, and I realized from her talk that the reason it's so important is the way we classify, the way we talk about kids totally shapes the way we respond. Okay, so if you are thinking of behaviors, if you have seen a kid and you are thinking about them as being bad, misbehaved, just trying to annoy me, irritating, difficult, all of these things people sometimes have about children, then what happens is your response tends to be like, well, how do I punish them if they're bad? What are the consequences for them doing this thing that is not preferred? Okay. If you begin to look at behavior as a communication, like they're often communicating something, problem solving, right? They've got a solution, or they think that they're going to get their needs met by doing this, or as a learned pattern, then your response is more likely to be reflective, responsive, considered. You're questioning, you're adapting, you're altering, you're shaping what you do, right? So let me give you an example, about a personal example. So just say I am in a really bad mood, and I got bad news at work. Maybe I got told off. Okay, I got told off by a supervisor that hadn't done something very well, and I'm a bit embarrassed about this. And so I get home, and my partner's very busy doing work, and I cause a problem. Okay. And really what's going on is I want him to ask me what's wrong. Okay, but instead of coming in and just saying, I've had a bad day, I need some sympathy, I need to be talked to, I come in and I start going off about the laundry. Okay? That's what I mean, that oftentimes, I'm using that example because oftentimes what you see on the outside and what's going on inside are two very different things. And you see this in your day-to-day life all the time. And honestly, since I began working with young children, where we work with parents to help identify what behaviours are communicating and working with a psych, it has totally changed the way I view my own behaviour at times when I recognise, really something else is going on here, and the behaviour of others, right? Because oftentimes this one here, I've got a yellow marker somewhere, getting our needs met, most of the time, that's what's going on with people, okay? That's what's going on with behaviour. So I'm going to give an example that came up on a group discussion board today about children that flap their hands, right? Oftentimes, it's actually communicating an emotive state. Like, this flapping might be happening because the child is very excited. And if you say, I think you're telling me you're excited. If you get it right, sometimes the behaviours will stop. You didn't have to tell them to stop. You didn't have to tell them to not do that. You recognise that flapping is about something that you don't quite understand, but it makes your response more considered, right? So in your assignments, I really want you to think about the way you're describing children and describing their behaviours. All right. So the assignment is basically this. I'm going over it again. You've got a child or a group of children and they have a special need, okay? You are being asked to identify a barrier, and you as a committee, principal, parent, teacher, whoever, are thinking about how to overcome this barrier based on the policy documents and what you know, all right? It's the law to have inclusion. Children need to be included in your programming, all right? So what's happening? What's the barrier? And how do you draw on these policy documents to argue for change? All right? Now, my suggestion is, and hold on, I'm just going to move so I can reach the textbook. Oh, there it is. So my suggestion to you is that you're actually pulling from a case that one of you knows or understands, okay? But, it's going to be much easier to identify a barrier if you can think of a good example, all right? If you're confused about your barrier, run it by me. So once again, the example I'm going to give is, you have a child that's in a wheelchair, his classrooms are on the second floor, he can't get to them, right? How are you going to advocate for that child using the policy documents? This is theoretical. So theoretically, you can have the perfect solution, right? You might understand that if you've got a group of children that kick and spit and bite, the reality of inclusion is difficult and requires expertise and requires input. But theoretically, you can do whatever you like in this assignment, right? All you have to do is justify it. Does that make sense? Okay. The other thing is, if you are talking about something and you need help figuring it out because you don't know that much about hearing impairment, then you're going to go to your chapter 12. There it is. Or if you are working with autism, I would expect that you are referring to chapter 13. I know there's a group doing gifted and talented. You should be drawing on chapter 14, all right? This is what your textbook's for. There are definitely other places that you can find out information, But mostly I would expect, and hang on, I'm going to turn this back to face me again, I think. But mostly I would expect that you're drawing on your textbook or articles, research articles that are a credible source. I do not advise you to just like do a web search and find some websites that maybe talk about autism or talk about Down syndrome. That's a blog. I wouldn't be using that as a reference, if that makes sense. Particularly with autism, there's a lot of different opinions out there, and not all of them are doing work that has any research basis behind it. Speaking of which, I'm going to share an article with you. I think it's up on the module. If it's not, I will make sure that it is this afternoon. This is the Providing Intervention for Young Children with Autism Spectrum. I'm talking about autism because a number of your groups are in fact have chosen children with autism to work on. Okay, and this is a really nice article for lots of different reasons. And basically it has a little bit of an overview of intervention, but it also has an educational focus. Okay, so it talks about a little bit about what we don't know, and I've highlighted some things I just want to talk to you about this morning. Some of the things we do know, it says, we do know children with ASD who receive high quality education and support early and throughout their life can be successful. We know that the number of children diagnosed with ASD continues to increase and that the amount of resources needed to support adults with ASD is staggering, all right? All of this stuff is much, much easier when we do it at a young age. Why do you think that is? Okay, part of the reason is if I'm seeing a 2 or a 3-year-old and working with parents around certain behaviours, they've only been doing those behaviours for 2 or 3 years at the most. What happens is if you keep doing something over and over and over again, you're basically developing neural pathways to support that. So really, really entrenched behaviours are very, very hard to change. I was talking to a teacher this morning who will do a guest lecture for us. She teaches 6th grade, so they're 12-year-olds, and I think in many ways her job is much harder than the work I've ever done, because the work I do tends to be with children who are under the age of 7. Okay, so there's a couple of things. You get these entrenched neural pathways, and then you get these patterns of behaviors. Like a child knows, for example, head banging is a great example. If I bang my head against a wall, you get adult attention really, really fast. So what the head banging becomes about, the first time it might have been done out of distress, genuine distress, or anxiety, and then the second time you realize, like, actually I get some real attention here, and so then it starts to not become what it was originally about. Does that make sense? Okay. So back to these authors, they say we still don't know what causes ASD, although we know some things that don't. So we know that vaccinations do not give children ASD. That said, we also know that it's become a problem where families are not vaccinating their kids because of the fear, and their children are getting very sick, sometimes dying from diseases that we really thought we'd eradicated and had under control a long time ago. And that's fine if you have decided you're going to take that risk for your own child. The bigger problem is and I just have to move over a sec so I can plug my phone in. The bigger issue becomes that, hold on one sec, sorry, technical glitch, I don't have my other cord, this one's very short, is that, a child has not been vaccinated, they give that to some other child at their preschool who has a different kind of immune system. and they could make other people's children sick, or that child has been immunized but their mother is pregnant with another child, and sometimes that can have an effect. So it's really given the basis that we know that immunizations do not cause ASD, it's been a very frustrating backlash that in Australia they're talking about if you don't immunize your child, then perhaps you won't get the same medical benefits as people who do, right? And it's because of the social issues, right? We're a country that you have free will, you can make this choice, however, you're not just making the choice for your own child, okay? So what I just want to say is we do know that there's lots of theories that have been disproved, and there are theories that I definitely, you still hear about despite the research, okay? So they said, we still don't know why some children respond to interventions and others with similar profiles do not. And we still do not know why people selling non-conventional interventions and theories seem to be attracted to ASD more than to other disabilities. And I would say part of that is there's just so much fear around ASD. We do know the numbers are growing and parents are very, very worried about it. So there's a lot of money in a gimmick, right? So people will agree to something just really to alleviate their own fear. And then the other reason I'd say is that the solutions, language development is very complicated, and helping children develop language is pretty intense. It requires lots of things and lots of effort. And so oftentimes people like the idea, well, if I use this special brush in their mouth, they'll talk, or if I get their tongue clipped, they'll talk, or because they're quick fix solutions, right? They're a much easier thing to rely upon. So if you're doing ASD, if you're doing children with ASD in your assignment, definitely this is an article that I want you to read, okay? I want to point out a couple of things. It has a whole section on inclusion issues, right? There's lots of research in determining how to maximize the potential of inclusive settings for children with ASD. It is not at all clear that significantly greater numbers of children are included in early childhood settings, despite what we know about the benefits of inclusion for these children. Okay? Access to inclusive settings is a cornerstone of federal legislation. It's not actually a choice, it's the law. And if you come upon parents and they've got stories, because you will, about their children being excluded, as a teacher, you get to do something about that, okay? You get to say, actually, it is the law, and if you go to your Department of Education, they move on these things really pretty quickly, okay? So what we really need is powerful, effective intervention strategies in the social development domain, okay? And that happens in the classroom. It best happens in the classroom, okay? So 6 major findings have emerged. Children with ASD have been shown to make gains in language, social skills, cognition, engagement in routines, and reductions in ASD symptoms in inclusive settings, okay? Number 2, when children with ASD are in physical proximity to other children with ASD, their autistic-like behaviours increase. So you're putting a bunch of kids together that are doing the same sort of thing, which isn't really your intention, right? You really want kids with ASD to be a part of the larger community. 3, typical children in these settings have only shown positive outcomes from inclusive experiences, okay? So there's no risk for children that don't have ASD. 4, serious topographies of problem behaviour have been addressed successfully in inclusive environments. So you might have a whole bunch of behaviours that go together, kicking, biting, spitting, and that they can be addressed in an inclusive classroom. And then 5, it's not true that only high-functioning children with ASD have benefited from inclusion. And 6, by far the most widely replicated strategy, peer-mediated intervention for addressing the core social behaviour deficits in children with ASD, relies on the daily presence and formal training of typical children. Okay? And then it goes on through the data and then some myths, and I really suggest that you you take a bit of a look at the article. Something else that I really wanted to point out on page 325 is, and this is about maximizing outcomes, is part of what you have in a classroom is these multiple contextually relevant opportunities to acquire and practice new skills. And this doesn't matter whether it's a child with ASD or a child learning to read. You want to give them lots and lots and lots of opportunities to practice this new skill that they're learning. You can't just model it. They also have to have the opportunity to do it themselves, first with help and then independently, okay? So you need child-focused, intentional instructional practices. And then one thing I did want to point out here, it says, student-teacher ratio should be low to allow staff to provide multiple and varied opportunities to respond each day. Now this is for children with ASD. The National Research Council recommended no more than 2 children with ASD per adult in each classroom. So you might argue as a classroom teacher then, like, inclusion is fine, and more than 2 children, I should have additional staff support. Okay, does that make sense? So if you are, I think that was the only other thing that I'd marked here. One of the things is, as you are referencing, if you do reference this, I started to do the APA reference. When it goes into your reference list, actually just have a look at their references on the first page, okay? So here you go. If you're citing something, actually let's start here. So if you're citing something, looking for an example, here we go. Especially those who do not benefit from early intervention is staggering. Okay, so this, and then you see a citation in parentheses, GANS 2007. What do we know? Single author paper published in 2007. Okay, this is here because it was GANS who said that. Not in those direct words, but that was his GANS's idea. Okay, look at where the punctuation is. Full stop on the outside of the citation. Right? Many people put the full stop at the end of the sentence. And when you're reading it, it means that the sentence is ended and GANS is in its own little thing, and I don't know where it belongs, okay? This full stop says this reference belongs to the idea that preceded it. Okay, these ones, if you've got multiple people that are basically, so what they're saying is this is the data, blah, 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 blah. All these people have done research about that data. When you have multiple authors in parenthetical citations, you use the ampersand, okay? This is how you divide. I can't remember what they're called right now. The word is totally gone. These things, this punctuation, is how you show me that this is a new reference, okay? Notice there's no first initials, it's just the last name, okay? Now, when you come to the reference list at the end, the reference for this paper will be Strain, P. comma, Schwartz. Taking this stress just from up here, I.S. comma, and Barton, E. comma, 2011. The article title, Providing Intervention for Young Children with Autism Spectrum Disorders, what we need to accomplish. Then you will have the Journal of Early Intervention, and then the volume information and the page numbers. Now, if you're confused and if you're not somewhere where you can access the internet and you want to go online, then don't worry. Oops, I forgot to go over this, but we'll not worry about that for now. Don't worry about that. Go to the back and see what they're doing, okay? Most of your research articles are going to be in APA. So let me find that GANS article. Here we see the full reference, GANS, the lifetime distribution of the incremental social costs of autism, Archives of Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine. Notice that's the name of the journal, and that is italicized, 161. It's a volume number, and here's the page number. You only need to put a page number into your citation if you have a direct quote. All right? So I'm hoping that will help you with the APA style. Let me just look what I'd highlighted to go over and I didn't remember to go over. Okay. Back to this idea of how we think about children, change it, how we talk about children, shapes how we then think about them. For me, as I'm thinking about children in the classroom, I'm always really thinking about how do we make their worlds bigger? How do we do things that are really functional? Okay, and part of the way you do this is by getting to know what the family want for this child. And in the end of this article, this Strain et al. Article, they talk about the idea of perhaps quality of life should be an outcome variable for positive behaviour support plans. So perhaps when we need to really re-envision education and putting quality of life as the focus rather than achievement on standardised tests, I'd say. And how then that allows for, if we're really continually thinking about quality of life, we could potentially choose assessment that was continuous, that was dynamic and responsive. Because of course, as children get older, what families want for their child is different. When they're little, often they want them to walk, they want them to talk, then they're going to want them to read. Maybe they don't. There's an interesting paper about, that I heard someone talking about this morning, that says when, what's his name? I'm going to find it for you and I'm actually going to put it online, that a scholar went out and interviewed a heap of Indigenous communities, people in Indigenous communities, over 300, and what they said they wanted from school was they wanted their children to be learning about culture and language, and there was a third thing. And then what culture, language, and